Moonshiners exclusive. Making a copper-lined mash barrel tutorial with Tickle and Tim on tonight's episode of Moonshiners on Discovery. We get a full-on copper still tutorial with Tim and Tickle, who show us carefully how to construct a watertight vessel to hold mash and make the beloved white lightning. Our Moonshiners exclusive is literally a mash barrel tutorial that shows you step by step how to make one from scratch. Tim notes that every still he has ever built is also a challenge, and that the process is as methodical as making moonshine. Tickle also shows how the copper metal wrap is crucial to be double secured with alternating rows of screws. Reckon I know what the mash feels like all up in this place. Now would be a bad time to rip a fart. I tell you what it would. Cooled it, get away from it. Tickle says as he is shown crouching down and tightly wedged inside the still. Explaining his methodology, Tickle says, "We're using screws with this being copper all the way around as we wanted a little bit more holding power. And just running one line of screws around it, that's not gonna cut it. You have to stagger the second row to be in between those that gives you more holding power over the length and the width of that joint. And that right there is how you make a watertight pot." Get updates on the latest posts and more from monsters and critics straight to your inbox. By submitting your information, you agree to our T&CS and privacy policy. Distillers all over the world swear by wood type and copper stills for making the best mash and ultimately finished product, whether it's simple moonshine or a single malt scotch. The artistry is in the blending, aging, and the nuances the wood actually imparts on the fermented mash as it is turned into a spirit over time. This is one of the reasons American white oak is prized not only by shiners, but by whiskey makers all over the globe, especially ones that age bourbon, or Spanish Oloroso sherry, or even wine. Tim is enjoying the entire process as it reminds him of the work his own father did in making pots from scratch. Every still I have built has been different, and you have to act on changes. The two men address cracks and figure out how to make the pot seaworthy to hold liquid. Admiring their work, Tickle says, "It looks like the prettiest still I have ever seen." Tickle notes how the process has really impressed Tim and says, "And back here working with Tim, and we're back in the woods, I think Tim's really enjoying it. It's bringing him back to his roots." Agreeing with Tickle, Tim says of their DIY copper still, "I mean, it brings me back to being with my dad when we were shiners." Also on tonight's episode, Tickle and Tim put fire to their first backwoods run in a decade. With 250 gallons of mash on the brink of expiring, Mark and Digger accidentally torpedo their own operation. And a minor screw-up for Josh triggers a domino effect that puts his entire site in jeopardy. Moonshiners exclusive. Making a copper-lined mash barrel with Tickle and Tim in the remote, mist-covered mountains of Appalachia, moonshining is a tradition as old as the hills themselves. It's a craft passed down through generations, steeped in both secrecy and pride. Every seasoned distiller knows that the art of making good moonshine isn't just about the recipe. It's about the equipment too. One of the most important pieces of gear, the mash barrel. Today, we're diving deep into an exclusive tutorial with two of the most well-known names in the moonshining business, Tickle and Tim, stars of Discovery Channel's Moonshiners. Together, they'll take us through the painstaking process of building a copper-lined mash barrel, a tool that plays a pivotal role in creating the perfect moonshine mash. Let's get to work. Chapter 1. Understanding the mash barrel. Before we roll up our sleeves and dive into the hands-on part, it's crucial to understand why the mash barrel is so important. The mash barrel is where the fermentation magic happens, where grains, water, and yeast come together to create the base liquid that will eventually become alcohol. While mash barrels can be made from various materials like wood or plastic, Copper is the preferred choice for seasoned moonshiners like Tickle and Tim. Copper is not only durable, but also has excellent heat conductivity and can help with the fermentation process. But beyond that, the beauty of a copper-lined barrel is in its ability to add a slight but noticeable influence on the flavor profile of the final product. The result? Smooth, rich moonshine that tastes as if it was made by the hands of the old-timers themselves. Chapter 2. Gathering materials. Building a copper-lined mash barrel might sound complicated, but with the right materials and a little elbow grease, it's entirely doable. Here's what Tickle and Tim recommend you gather before getting started. 1. The barrel material: oak, or your preferred wood type size, 50 to 100 gallons, depending on your scale source. You can purchase a pre-made oak barrel or build your own frame. The key here is to make sure it's sealed tightly and can hold both the weight and pressure of the mash. 2. Copper lining thickness: 24 gauge copper sheet source. You can find copper sheets at any metal supplier or online store. Dimensions: you'll need enough copper to line the inside of the barrel. Make sure to measure your barrel's interior carefully before cutting your copper sheets. 3. Tool hammer and rivets for shaping and attaching the copper lining. Copper tacks and sealant to secure the copper firmly and prevent leaks. Soldering iron to finish sealing any small seams or holes that may be present. Metal shears to cut the copper sheets into manageable pieces. 4. Miscellaneous items: wooden staves for the outside of the barrel if you plan to build the frame yourself. Barrel hoop bands. These metal bands will hold the barrel together tightly. Epoxy resin to waterproof the barrel and prevent wood rot. Chapter 3. Preparing the barrel. Now, it's time to prepare the barrel. Tickle and Tim have a saying: if your barrel ain't right, your mash ain't gonna be right. So let's get this step done with care. Step 1. Cutting the wooden staves. If you're building the barrel from scratch, you'll need to cut the wooden staves, the long pieces that form the sides of the barrel. Each stave needs to be beveled so they fit tightly together to form the barrel's cylindrical shape. Tickle's advice: it's all about precision. If your staves don't fit tight, you're asking for leaks. Once the staves are cut and beveled, assemble them into a ring shape and secure them temporarily with clamps. Make sure to check that everything is even and level before moving on to the next step. Step 2. Installing the copper bottom. Before you begin adding the copper lining, it's best to install the copper at the bottom of the barrel. Why? This is where most of the mash's heat will be concentrated during fermentation, so having a copper bottom will help distribute that heat evenly. To do this, cut a copper sheet that matches the diameter of your barrel's base. Use a soldering iron to seal the edges of the copper to the barrel, ensuring no gaps are left where the mash could escape. Chapter 4. Lining the barrel with copper. The next step is what makes this barrel truly special: lining the inside with copper. Tickle and Tim swear by this technique, as it ensures an even fermentation process and enhances the final flavor of the moonshine. Here's how to do it. Step 1. Measure and cut the copper sheet. Start by measuring the interior of the barrel. You'll need enough copper to cover the entire inside surface, leaving a little overlap at the top. Once you have your measurements, cut the copper sheets into strips that fit the barrel's height. Step 2. Wrapping the copper around the barrel. Carefully roll the copper sheets into a cylindrical shape and fit them snugly inside the barrel. You may need to trim the edges or make small adjustments to ensure the copper fits perfectly. Tickle suggests using a rubber mallet to gently tap the copper into place, ensuring it's flush with the wood. Step 3. Attaching the copper. Once the copper is positioned correctly, it's time to secure it. Use copper tacks or small rivets to attach the copper to the wood. Ensure that the copper is evenly spaced and securely fastened. If you're using rivets, be sure to hammer them in firmly, but not too forcefully, as you don't want to damage the copper. Step 4. Sealing the seams. To seal the seams between the copper sheets, Tim recommends using a high-quality copper solder. This will ensure that there are no leaks and that the copper lining remains intact for years of use. Gently apply heat to the seams with a soldering iron, and then apply the solder to seal the edges. Once the solder is cooled, you can lightly sand the seams for a smooth finish. Chapter 5. Finishing touches. With the copper lining securely in place, it's time to finish off the barrel. Here's where the fine details come into play. Step 1. Securing the barrel's shape using barrel hoop bands. Tighten the metal hoops around the barrel. This will hold everything in place, making sure the staves and copper lining don't shift out of alignment. Step 2. Waterproofing the wood. To prevent the wooden staves from rotting over time, coat them with an epoxy resin. This will help seal the wood and ensure that it stays durable under the weight of the mash. Be sure to use a non-toxic, food-safe resin, as this will ensure that no harmful chemicals leach into the mash. Step 3. Final inspection. Now that the barrel is fully assembled, Tickle and Tim always suggest giving it a final inspection. Run your hands along the seams to check for any leaks. Test the barrel by adding a little water to it and checking for leaks. If any appear, simply reseal the spots with some extra copper tacks and epoxy. Chapter 6. Ready for mash. With the copper-lined mash barrel complete, it's time to start the most exciting making moonshine.